Right, ErinO'Toole is back in the House of Commons, and he does this 1-hour speech. He's looking like he's a little bit sick, so he's a trooper. He's going in when maybe he's getting over all the illnesses, and apparently he's non-contagious now and everything. So it's not like he's. Though this is an hour speech, it's an excellent job. Check it out.
Orders of the day, resuming debate on the debate address in the reply to the speech to the throne.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to be back here in the House again with my colleagues, and I'm happy to speak to Canadians about my plan for their jobs and their families.
I want to start off by saying how proud I am of mine. And I know my wife, Rebecca, Molly, and Jack, and my parents are probably watching this speech that I give in my first day as Conservative Party leader in the House of Commons. What an honor it is for me to represent Durham in the House, the area I grew up as a member of Parliament, now to stand and represent them, and to be the leader of the party that founded this great country. What an intense honor for me, Mr. Speaker, and I will try to live up to that incredible precedent before me. I also want to start off by thanking the thousands of Canadians who reached out and said good words, sent prayers, and their best thoughts for my family as Rebecca and I were overcoming COVID-19. I also want to thank the incredible healthcare workers we interacted with, Jose, our personal healthcare office guide who called and checked in almost every day. People like that are working tirelessly for Canadians in every corner of this country. Thank you for the sacrifices you are making. I've seen you in action. And at the edge of a second wave, I want, on behalf of the Conservative Party, to thank all of our frontline healthcare workers for everything you're doing throughout this pandemic.
Here.
Canadians can be proud of their healthcare guardian angels, the doctors, the nurses, the orderlies. They were there when we needed them. They were on the front lines of our fight against the virus that our country didn't see coming. Canada wasn't ready, but they were. They were ready to risk their health for us. And now that the fight has started again against the second wave, we know that we can count on them. So on behalf of the Conservative Party, thank you to all of you.
2 weeks ago, my wife Rebecca and I bundled the kids, Molly and Jack, into a car and went and waited hours in line for COVID testing, just like thousands of other families did across this country the very same day. We waited for hours only to be turned away, Madam Speaker. The healthcare worker who was managing the line and going through and apologizing to each family as they were sent away wanted to tell us where to go to get another test. But he said every testing site was so busy that places weren't even answering their phone. That dedicated healthcare worker looked more disappointed than we were that day because there was no hope or news they could provide to those families. Now, we went home. We're fortunate. We called around. I have an office now that helps me call around, and I found out that my workplace provided a test. And a few days later, our family took advantage of that test. But as we did that, Rebecca and I talked about all of those other hundreds of families in the line with us that day. How many of them did not have a workplace that could help them out of days and days of waiting? How many of them had to take more days off of work because their children couldn't return to school without a clear test? How many of them had to change plans for taking care of an ill neighbor or a grandparent? How many were left stranded, Madam Speaker? That is all we could think about, as we were fortunate to get tested. After all, just a year ago, if we were experiencing some of these cold or mild flu-like symptoms, we would have just powered through. Many Canadians actually take pride in never having taken a sick day, always stepping up for their classes, always stepping up for a shift, and not letting a cold or flu hold them back. I admire these work characteristics, Madam Speaker. This is the sort of hard work and perseverance that built this great country. But in a pandemic, those same characteristics can also cause public health challenges. That same approach, Canadians should realize, could spread the coronavirus to other Canadians. So times have changed, and we have to be cautious and change with them. And we think about the people that don't have options, the single mother who may be working a few jobs to make sure all the bills are paid and can't risk missing one to have to take care of a child at home. A new Canadian who may have been in their new job just for a few years. They're worried about potentially missing work, wanting to keep their coworkers safe and healthy, but knowing they need to make the next rent payment. There are millions of Canadians, like that new Canadian family, like that single mother, who were left out of the throne speech last week, Madam Speaker. There was nothing but empty words in there for them. And a throne speech, particularly after prorogation, which this Prime Minister said he would never do to avoid a scandal, that prorogation, that throne speech could have provided a clear and distinct plan on the eve of a second wave of this pandemic. It failed to do that, Madam Speaker. One way the Prime Minister could have given these Canadians more peace of mind is through rapid testing, particularly for asymptomatic patients, particularly for families to avoid the lines. The Prime Minister knows this, Madam Speaker. In fact, the Prime Minister himself has said, I quote, "We know that massive testing has been part of the solution in places that have managed to contain or slow the spread of COVID-19." End quote, Madam Speaker. The trouble is, the Prime Minister said this in March, in the first wave of the pandemic. And like many things, when the TV cameras go off, when the tweets have been sent, there is no follow-up. There is no leadership. There is no accountability, Madam Speaker. And in this speech from the throne, we saw an absence of leadership at a time Canadians, thousands in line, waking up at 3 in the morning to line up, are desperate for some leadership, Madam Speaker. All they get with this Prime Minister is disappointment after disappointment. 15 other countries, developed countries, our closest allies, already have available rapid test options that give their citizens answers in minutes, Madam Speaker. As I said today, the Prime Minister doesn't seem to realize the CETA, the European Trade Agreement, that my friend from Abbotsford actually negotiated, thank you very much, actually allows for us to recognize the regulatory approval for medical kits, diagnostic tests from those countries. They talk about it, they tweet about it. Where was the action, Madam Speaker? Just more disappointment. Half a year after the Prime Minister said rapid testing was important, $500 billion later, Madam Speaker, there are tens of thousands of Canadians in line forgotten. Canadian families deserve better than this. They were looking for some answers. They were looking for a second wave plan in the throne speech. They heard nothing, Madam Speaker. And they also had no sense of purpose for the economic recovery for our country. In fact, because they prorogued, all of the programs from the CERB to the rent assistance were expiring. They decided to prorogue to avoid difficult questions from some of my colleagues on the WE scandal, rather than get Parliament to diligently work towards a plan for small businesses, for families, for the second wave. Madam Speaker, hashtags and photo ops do not prepare this country for a crisis, Madam Speaker. And that is why the Conservative government in waiting will start to offer that plan to Canadians. And let's look back, Madam Speaker, because we've still not got an answer from the Prime Minister or the Health Minister, who most Canadians lost faith in early March. We've still not been told why in May of 2019 they closed the early pandemic warning system, the Global Public Health Intelligence Network. They cut it, closed it, no answer, and experts have shown that could have helped not just thousands of Canadians, it could have helped the world with a better response to COVID-19. The government was warned of risks in December of last year, in January of this year, and Madam Speaker, I'm aware of at least 5 departments of the federal government that were aware of the pandemic risks to Canadians, including health and economic risks, in January. In January, Madam Speaker. And by then, with no response, no plan, they were already letting hundreds of cases into Canada. By February, they had already sent critical personal protective equipment to China at a time their own departments were being warned that Beijing was trying to rally global supply of PPE, while they weren't being transparent on the full extent of the outbreak of the coronavirus, while departments were warning them of the inadequacy of our own supply. They were sending supplies and once again tweeting rather than planning. The government not only ignored our questions about the border, including from my colleague in Prince George in January about closing the border to flights from at-risk countries, they accused the opposition of being intolerant, Madam Speaker. We've got this, the health minister said. In fact, for a month and a half, she downplayed the risk to our country at all of this pandemic, Madam Speaker. That's what I say. Most Canadians had already lost faith in the health minister by that point. Conservatives propose using the EI system to prepare the economy for outages. Later on, when that wasn't used, we asked the government to push from a 10% wage subsidy program to a 75% so we could preserve jobs. So there was something to return to after the closures of the first wave. Unfortunately, we proposed this, we proposed the GST remittance, faster and more direct rent relief to the small businesses, not to the big landlords who took their time to often opt out. The Liberals sadly got most of their programs slow or wrong, Madam Speaker. They had to introduce not one emergency bill, but 2 emergency bills, because the first one was insufficient. Now, we were all working hard. The whole world were responding, Madam Speaker. But Canadians expect their government to also work smart. They expect their government and their Prime Minister and their Health Minister to learn the lessons when they drop the ball in the first round. When the Prime Minister says in March that rapid testing is Canada's priority, we should be rolling out hundreds of thousands of rapid tests today, Madam Speaker.
That's right.
Today. Who is accountable there? Who is accountable? 5 departments of the federal government knew in January. The Prime Minister pledged to be prepared for the first, let alone the second wave. And just yesterday, they bought a rapid test and approved it the next day, Madam Speaker. Rather than competing for the bottom, we should be looking to see how New Zealand, how Taiwan, how Australia, how Vietnam responded, and learning the lessons. not just looking at the poor response and the poor results in the United States, Madam Speaker. It reminds me of my land survival training in the Air Force, and one of these wise old trappers in Hinton, Alberta, was asked a question when we were put out into the wilderness to survive as young Air Force officers. And somebody asked, "How do you survive a bear attack, Madam Speaker?" And the old wise trapper just said, "Well, you just have to run faster than your friend." That seems to be the Prime Minister's self-assessment of his response from COVID. We seem to be running slightly faster than our friends to the south, but we're not learning from the countries that got it right, Madam Speaker.
That's right.
Hashtags, inaction, and ethical scandal. Those are the consistencies we see with this Prime Minister. Canadians, particularly in the biggest crisis of all of our lifetime, expect more.
That's right.
They expect a plan, and they expect a response when families are worried about a second wave.
Comme vous le savez, Madame.
As you know, Madam Speaker, when I speak about health, I talk about the most important role of a government. That is, to ensure the health and safety of Canadians. And in Quebec, we know that the federal government was not up to the task. Presenting CERB before it had a wage subsidy program, this risked jobs, waiting months to have rapid testing, but refusing what our allies are doing. This jeopardized confidence by Canadians. Keeping the borders open. To be politically correct, this endangered the lives of Canadians. Canadian and Quebec families have sacrificed a lot during the pandemic. Seeing grandparents, going to weddings, having graduation, and many Quebecers know a family member who got sick. Long-term care homes faced major challenges. We all know the sad story of the long-term care homes. But what bothers me the most is to know that the Liberal government waited too long before it sent the army into these care homes. The Quebec government asked for help from the federal government, and the federal government waited. Canadians are proud of our armed forces. We're talking about our men and women in uniform who came to help during a time of crisis. And they stayed longer, or would have if the Liberals had let them do their job. Now, the Prime Minister is playing petty politics by imposing his own health care priorities on the provinces. Canadians have seen enough Liberal mistakes and now don't trust them. My plan is clear. I will increase transfers, healthcare transfers to the provinces, ensure they are predictable, stable, and unconditional. It is a matter of respect for provincial jurisdiction, our partners, because we can count on our partners. We can count on our caregivers, on our nurses, on our doctors. We can count on our Canadian Armed Forces, but we cannot count on this government.
Sure, Canada is better prepared next time, Madam Speaker. Who is going to make sure that Canada learns the lessons from the first wave and fixes the gaps and some of the problems that have put our citizens at risk? Who is going to make sure that working Canadian families stop getting left behind by this government. Now, Canadians are still getting to know me as the new leader of the Conservative Party and leader of the official opposition. Only the most dedicated political animals saw my speech live at 1:30 in the morning, Madam Speaker. My second big speech from my doorstep, through adversity to the stars, Madam Speaker. As more Canadians get to know me, they will know that I set high standards for myself and this incredible team. We are a government in waiting, Madam Speaker, and we do not accept the poor response and the lack of lessons learned by this government at a time of crisis. That's right. They will also get to know that I have tried to spend my entire life standing up for this country. I was not born with a sense of entitlement to lead the country, but I've worked hard my entire life to serve Canada and its people to earn the chance to lead. That is what we need in public life when we face a national unity crisis, a pandemic, economic rebuilding, and uncertainty on the global stage. Someone who will fight to ensure that no Canadian family gets left behind. Someone who understands the importance of service and community. Many Canadians know I'm very proud to be a veteran, Madam Speaker. I'm also proud to be a Legion member and a Rotarian. In fact, in this House, there are probably dozens of Lions and Legion members and Knights of Columbus, Kinsmans, Optimists, Kiwanis. For decades, service clubs, faith organizations, community groups have been the pillars of strong communities, Madam Speaker, allowing Canadians to come together to accomplish great things together. Service above self, Madam Speaker. As a kid who grew up in a General Motors family, I also know that one of those organizations that helps build strong communities are unions. Organized labor helps build strong communities, Madam Speaker. Unions foster community and workplace cultures where workers know that someone has their back. Someone's fighting for them, as opposed to just agreeing with whatever the government says, like that member, Mr. Speaker. Someone that will fight for you when you're sick, someone that will fight for you to avoid the steel and aluminum tariffs that this government allowed to get applied on our hardworking families across the country.
That's right.
Madam Speaker, I grew up on a street where neighbors looked out for one another. I've talked personally about when my mom was ill as a kid. My family, our neighbors, were there to help. They were there for the meal. They were there to ask to make sure the kids were okay. Strong communities take care of each other and foster a culture that values the health and well-being of those in their community. They value you, Madam Speaker, and everyone. Conservatives do not believe that big government programs are the solution to all problems. In fact, big and massive government can sometimes be part of the problem. Government can, by its very nature, Madam Speaker, stand between people. A government can give you clemency, but a government can also give you dependency. Only a community and your belonging to it can give you solidarity. The Prime Minister doesn't understand the challenges facing our country because he's never had to understand the challenges facing the average Canadian family.
That's right.
Under this government, Canada has become less united, less prosperous, and less respected on the world stage. And a large reason is because our Canadian community is being weakened under this Prime Minister. The Prime Minister likes to preach that we're all in this together, but Canadians have seen time after time with this Prime Minister that that is not true. Millions of Canadians were already left out of the throne speech. They aren't all there, as the Prime Minister likes to say. In fact, they have seen many times that all in it together for this government means the friends and family of the Liberal Party first and regular Canadians second. Connected lobbyists for big corporations first and the Attorney General in their own caucus second. The family of the Prime Minister benefiting and the Finance Minister arranging a program for the charity that helped the family. In the middle of a pandemic, they're helping their friends and connected insiders. In the middle of a pandemic, they were suppressing the ability for Parliament to oversee spending while they were creating a multi-million-dollar plan to pay volunteers. Madam Speaker, when I talked about that sense of community earlier that we see in unions, we see in service clubs and faith communities, the great thing is the altruism. They don't have to be paid, Madam Speaker. How novel is that for the big government and connected insiders party? Canadians are left behind if they're not a Liberal insider with this government. They gave a sole source contract to an MP whose seat was hardly cold because he just left the seat, Madam Speaker. They're applying national security exemptions to cover up decisions made related to tendering during the pandemic, Madam Speaker. Think about that. The government's claiming national security grounds so Canadians don't get to see who got contracts for hospital gowns or N95 masks, Madam Speaker. Is national security actually at risk? Or are the Liberal re-election chances at risk, Madam Speaker? That's right. The Prime Minister has built his electoral success on dividing Canadians. Province versus province, industry sector versus industry sector, rural versus urban, friends of the Liberal Party, the Laurier Club versus everybody else. Now the Prime Minister continues that approach with the throne speech. He's not made Canada more stronger, resilient. He hasn't shown we've learned lessons from the first wave of the pandemic, yet he's leaving people out of his vision for building back better. Demonizing Canadians because you work in the resource sector or that you grow up hunting with your family. Canceling out people because of their difference of opinion or their religious faith. Groups that were doing summer jobs programs to grow that sense of community cut off because it was associated with a church, a mosque, a gurdwara, or a synagogue. How is that bringing people together, Madam Speaker? You may not always get along with your neighbor, but in the winter, when they shovel your walk before you get home at the end of the day, you're grateful for them. When they take your recycling bins in or offer to walk your dog, you know they're there and you feel that sense of community. Rebecca and I have seen that on a daily basis as friends and neighbors drop off meals. Her best friend, Dawn, dropping Tim Hortons, ringing the doorbell, and driving away. That is what keeps a country strong. That is what gives people hope on the edge of a second wave. Because Canadians know that community means you return the favor if they get into an entanglement or if they're in lockdown because of COVID-19. And wouldn't most Canadians help that neighbor just like ours helped me when I was a little kid or our family this week? Would you not help that neighbor because they worked in the oil patch or came from Alberta or Newfoundland and Labrador? Is that what we're trying or starting to see with the approach of choosing who is part of building back better? Because that appears to be the path this government is on. The vision presented in the throne speech where you're judged by the job you have or where you live, or if you're even lucky enough to have a job after COVID. A Canadian where the government decides what job you have and what car you drive. A Canada where millions of Canadians are knowingly left behind and are told the country will be building back better without them. And the Prime Minister attacked me for suggesting we have national unity challenges, Madam Speaker. 5 years ago, when I was sworn into the Privy Council, the Bloc Québécois was not an official party. There was no such thing as the Wexit movement, Madam Speaker. Now there are more members signed up for an email looking into separation than there are members of the Liberal Party of Canada, Madam Speaker. That is the Prime Minister's record. And we are going to be holding him to account. Because as I said in my first conversation with him, the most important job of a Canadian Prime Minister is supporting Canadian families and keeping our Federation united. And what we should do is respect the inherent dignity that goes into working. Whether in the forestry sector in Western Canada or Quebec, in the oil patch, in manufacturing, aluminum in the Saguenay, when you use your sweat equity and dedication to save for your home or your children's education, there's a fundamental aspect of your character attached to the nobility of work. You believe you're part of something bigger than yourself. Your vision of work gives you value and dignity that is far greater than a paycheck. It's time that government thought this way and valued tax dollars, valued Canadian workers and the work they do rather than the sector they're in. Les libéraux semblent toujours l'oublier.
Always seem to forget, but the federal government has an ally when it comes to managing the pandemic, an ally it knows well, who knows well the needs of the people, and who's working hard to educate, care for, and put people to work. This ally is the provinces. The Liberals continue to govern as if it was their birthright to be in power. The Prime Minister is an example of that. When you're the natural governing party of Canada, you govern by way of confrontation, not collaboration. But the Liberals are wrong. Our country's a federation, an alliance of provinces that share a common destiny as well as a shared dream. And the Prime Minister of Canada must be the link. As Prime Minister, I will be a partner, not a paternalist. This is my vision of federalism. Decentralized federalism, where we trust the provinces, where we encourage resource development in the West, and that respects the Quebec nation.
Avec les libéraux.
With the Liberals, these are taboo topics. It's not modern enough for them, but that Liberal arrogance has to stop. Canada was not founded by Pierre Elliott Trudeau, but by Sir John A. Macdonald and Sir George Etienne Cartier. Canada is not a post-national country with no history and no identity. It's an alliance between two founding people together with the First Nations. The Liberals do not have a monopoly on Canadian identity, nor do they have a monopoly on freedom of speech. And they especially don't have a monopoly on our national pride. The Prime Minister likes to scaremonger when talking about right-wing discourse. he likes to fan the flames of Western separatism, and now the Bloc Québécois is back in force, all because of the arrogance of this government. It's time that we had a Prime Minister who would unite Canada, because we cannot afford to be divided. We have a country to rebuild.
Dignity of work has taken a blow with the impacts of COVID-19, particularly on family-owned small businesses. Going back to strong communities, often small businesses, entrepreneurs are at the core of that sense of community. Like the music store in downtown Belleville, Ontario, Pinnacle Music, owned by Janet and Ken Hardin. They just closed their door after 25 years. At their peak, they had 600 students taking music lessons every week. Great Big C's Alan Doyle would drop by when he was in town. They played a major role in bringing people together through music and community. Their supply chain was devastated by COVID-19, and none of the government's programs worked for a small, family-owned business like theirs. They recently made the tough decision after a generation to close. Other places, like the legendary Ranchman's Cookhouse and Dance Hall in Calgary, synonymous with Western culture for half a century. This month, the property was for lease for the first time in its history and closed its doors due to COVID-19. Restaurants like Campagnolo and Frederico's Supper Club in Vancouver, who have had to permanently close their doors. Small businesses that even put communities on the map, like Caribou Crossing near Carcross in Yukon. They've been struggling as COVID-19 has shut down tourism. Across Canada's north, generations of guide outfitters who not only play an important role in the rural economy, but also are dedicated stewards to the environment and to wildlife populations. They've had nothing to fall back on. Others have remortgaged their homes just to keep businesses on Main Street open. Some have pivoted their businesses to find new ways to help their communities in a crisis, like the mompreneur who owns Sahoma Naturals in Digby, Nova Scotia, who switched from making diaper balm to hand sanitizer during the pandemic. These small businesses are at the heart of strong communities. Canada doesn't need them to build back better. They don't need the Liberal government in Ottawa to tell them their contributions have value. Canada needs to build back stronger and smarter by setting up small business for recovery and success post-COVID-19. We need to ensure that more Canadians aren't left behind like they were in the throne speech. Picking winners and losers in the midst of a pandemic, as the Prime Minister seems intent on doing, is a failure of leadership and an abandonment to a commitment to the community of Canada. Indigenous communities have also been left behind with an Ottawa knows best agenda. Indigenous communities have been strengthened by entrepreneurship and small business ownership, only to watch opportunities vanish. From catering services to remote mining operations to security and construction, the prosperity of this country, including our resource sector, can be shared by all Canadians, including Indigenous-led businesses and families. Indigenous communities have known more than their share of tragedy. That's why I, like many members here today, wear orange to show support for reconciliation. It's why we asked several questions on the subject today. It's also why I was disappointed to see the Prime Minister's condescending remarks about how happy he is to see the Conservatives talking about reconciliation. Both parties, Madam Speaker, have a bad record when it comes to the Indigenous experience, particularly surrounding residential schools. The condescension comes from ignorance, Madam Speaker. The last Prime Minister in our lifetime to open residential schools was Pierre Trudeau, Madam Speaker. Brian Mulroney closed the program, and I was proud Stephen Harper apologized for it. We have a lot to do on this side, Madam Speaker, but they certainly have a lot to do as well.
That's right.
And Indigenous Canadians are tired of the photo ops, of the hashtags, and the inaction on progress. Because to Conservatives especially, and to Indigenous entrepreneurs, reconciliation means opportunity, means collaboration, means participation in the Canadian economy. Encouraging Indigenous businesses, building strong economies in Indigenous communities, developing Indigenous supply chains, and giving Indigenous young people brighter futures is part of our commitment to reconciliation, Madam Speaker. Indigenous businesses are hiring local workers and reinvesting in their communities. Yet they still don't have access to compete for procurement and federal government contracts. This, too, was not addressed in the throne speech. $500 billion almost out the door, Madam Speaker. And today my colleague talked about cuts to high-speed connectivity for rural Indigenous communities. Is that his priority, Madam Speaker? Because it's certainly his record. Monsieur le Président, nous avons...
Mr. Speaker, we need a serious government, a government that saves in good times to prepare for bad times, a government that encourages growth, economic growth, a government that offers peace, order, and good governance with integrity. That's what our ancestors always did. That's what the Conservatives will continue to do. And that's what I will do as Prime Minister. In a time of crisis and uncertainty, this is not the time to experiment, to conduct social experiments like those announced in the throne speech. As if just providing good jobs for Canadians wasn't glamorous enough for this Prime Minister. As if hashtags and tweets were necessary. As if it was necessary to look good at the UN. As if it was necessary to work for a tech firm to be happy. Perhaps the Prime Minister should meet some real people. Perhaps the Prime Minister should meet some small business people who've risked everything for their business. Businesses like La Normandie restaurant in Saguenay, a family business that's been around for 30 years, and they had to close their doors because of the pandemic and poorly organized federal assistance. Montreal institutions like l'Entrecôte Saint-Jean and the Librairie, which suffered too greatly from all the uncertainty. Between taxes and paperwork, small and medium-sized businesses are fed up, and yet the Liberal government continues to embark on another spending frenzy, Madam Speaker. They even kicked out the finance minister because he did not want to mushroom the debt. If the money were at least going to Canadians instead of Liberal cronies in the WE scandal, if our children and grandkids, if nothing's done, they'll have to pay the tab. This is not imaginary. When the Liberals refuse to develop our resources, when they refuse to fight for softwood, when they refuse to put an end to illegal blockades, they put the survival of our safety, our social programs in danger. Same thing when it goes to our hospitals, our universities, and our seniors' pensions. All these things are endangered by the Liberal debt. Yes, Madam Speaker, it's time for a serious government. The country needs one.
Prime Minister of Canada, when they represent our country abroad, is to stand up for the national interest and our values as a country. We must also foster strong communities with our allies. Putting the national interest first doesn't mean we have to go alone. For the last 3 decades, an uneasy compromise has existed with the engagement of non-market economies and countries who resist democracy and rules-based diplomacy. Our belief as conservatives in free markets and the positive influence of capitalism has fought for equal position with our commitment to international freedom and democracy when it comes to communist China. As conservatives, we normally believe that tariffs are bad for consumers. Free trade is supposed to lead to more free nations and greater prosperity as the market allocates economic resources to places that allow for goods to be produced and marketed for the greatest benefit of the greatest number of people. I still believe in free trade, Madam Speaker, but I also believe in fair trade where countries follow the rules. Free trade amongst free and democratic nations. I believe in free markets, free trade, even free movement with the UK, Australia, and New Zealand and Kanzak, Madam Speaker. I also believe that we have to resist the protectionist instincts of our American friends because we do more than $1 billion of business with them every day. Because the aluminum in Kitimat and in the Saguenay has been a North American enterprise that helped win the Second World War. Because since the 1960s and the Auto Pact, we have had an integrated manufacturing and steel industry in North America, and we have to remind our American friends about that, and sadly, we have to remind this government about that. I even believe we should build new relationships, particularly grow our relationship with India and establish closer economic ties with the democratic regime in Taiwan. But the price of market outcomes is too high when it comes to the communist regime in Beijing. The price for Canadian auto workers, steel workers, and aluminum workers is too high. The price for access to safe and reliable PPE and medical prices, medical products in a pandemic is too high. The price for Canadian communities and the Canadians being left behind is too high. China has ignored almost all of the conditions under which it entered the WTO. Its interference through its state-owned enterprises would not be tolerated from any other WTO member. For more than a decade, the chief economic exports from China often has been IP infringement, counterfeiting, and digital privacy. I saw this firsthand when I worked in the private sector fighting the rise and export of dangerous counterfeit goods from mainland China. And all of this before we even raise the terrible ethnic cleansing of Uyghur Muslims, Madam Speaker. The establishment of a police state in a once-free Hong Kong under a one-country, two-systems agreement. The rapid expansion of their military into the South China Sea. The assertion of China as a near-Arctic nation, and the suppression of Christian communities in China. Let there be no mistake, Madam Speaker, I'm in favor of free trade, but the cost of market outcomes with Beijing is simply becoming too high, and the approach of this government is simply out of touch, Madam Speaker. Do we continue to ignore re-education camps in Western China to grow our exports? Or do we open new markets, work with our allies, and rebalance global trade to show the Communist Party in Beijing that the one thing not for sale is our values? To do this, we must help Canadian businesses grow new market opportunities, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, and break dependency with China. We must also show a commitment to free trade alongside the value of freedom. Under the Prime Minister's leadership, Canada has become less united, less prosperous, and less respected on the world stage. Tonight I've talked about some of the tens of thousands of Canadians left behind in his throne speech. Our communities are becoming weakened, families are worried, and our confederation strained. Le Premier Ministre divise notre...
The Prime Minister is dividing our country east and west, is erasing our history, and is embarrassing us internationally.
After being attacked as tax cheats 3 years ago, family-owned enterprises were largely left out of the COVID response, and now tens of thousands of them are teetering on the edge of insolvency. They don't need to build back better, Madam Speaker. They need to stay open so the family can survive. Canadians are tired of being pit against one another. Sector versus sector, rural versus urban, west versus east, because it's really neighbor versus neighbor, Madam Speaker. At a time when we need more than ever to be united, to work together, to have each other's back, Canada doesn't need another slogan or a hashtag. It needs a plan. It doesn't need a poster boy, Madam Speaker. It needs a handyman. People don't need the cold shoulder of indifference, but the hope that comes from a helpful hand helping them get back to work. It needs to build back stronger, and the only way that can happen is with a united Canada. A Canada where prosperity is shared from our outport communities in Newfoundland to the Saguenay, to the factory floors in Windsor, to the oil patch of Alberta and the lower mainland of British Columbia. A Canada where no Canadian is left behind. Le Canada has besoin.
Canada needs to be a place for those who work hard and are proud of that.
Canadians, with a plan for all of Canada, not just the parts where the Liberal government finds its votes. Canada is a great country, Madam Speaker, built on the communities that have always had one another's back without question. And that, Madam Speaker, is why so many Canadians feel left out of this prorogation, we scandal-avoiding throne speech. To all those Canadians, especially those feeling forgotten, especially those in lineups for rapid tests, especially those worried about a job loss in a second wave of COVID, I want you to know I'm proud to lead a strong, united Conservative government in waiting, and my goal in the coming months, Madam Speaker, is that more of these Canadians will see a Conservative look at them when they look in the mirror each morning. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Order. Order.
Conformément à l'article 30.
Pursuant to Standing Order 38, I will inform the House.
All right, the bonus from Strahl here, his petition, and the Speaker makes a decision from the February thing that was from yesterday, and well, no surprise, check it out.
Presenting petitions. Présentation de pétitions.
Presenting petitions.
Mr. Strahl already did present. Another one. The Honourable Member for Chilliwack Hope has another petition.
I have a petition, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you already went. Please go ahead.
Mr. Speaker, it is my privilege to introduce a petition on behalf of my constituent, Jocelyn James, whose son Stephen lives with cystic fibrosis. His access to life-changing new medicines has been put at risk by the government's proposed price restrictions, which have stopped new treatments from coming to Canada. Over 17,000 Canadians signed this petition and are calling upon the Government of Canada to repeal the changes to the patented medicines regulations that were adopted in 2019, engage in substantive, transparent, and evidence-based consultations with stakeholders on any changes to the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, and work with patients, clinicians, provincial health systems, researchers, and medicine developers to inform the federal price review regime so that it does not prevent Canadians like Stephen from gaining access to life-changing and potentially life-saving medicines and clinical trials. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Presenting petitions. Présentation de pétitions. Okay, very good. Questions on the order paper. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would ask that all questions be allowed to stand at this time, please.
Agreed. Good, thank you. Je désire
I would like to inform the House that because of Minister's statements, government affairs will be prolonged by 27 minutes this evening.
We'll go on. Je suis prêt à me...
I'm ready to pronounce the question of privilege that asks the chair to statute on the question of privilege that was a prima facie one during the previous session. At the time, the matter involved the premature disclosure of the content of Bill C-7, an act to amend the criminal code with regard to medical assistance in dying, while it was on notice awaiting introduction and first reading.
Intervention, the member reminded the House that the question was raised earlier this year on February 25th and was referred to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs on March 10th. When the Speaker gave leave to move the appropriate motion, I want to thank the member for the clarity of his remarks and for the precedents he cited to bolster his case. Both helped me understand the issue in play. The Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader also intervened, focusing his remarks on the timelines for raising the questions of privilege. As members are well aware, when questions of privilege are raised, the role of the chair is to determine if the claim relates to the breach of privilege or a contempt that deserves priority of consideration over all other business before the House. It is not the responsibility of the chair to decide whether there is an actual offence or its seriousness. Such a matter is determined by the House itself. This is one of the two criteria that the Speaker has to consider in assessing an alleged breach of privilege. The second criterion is whether the matter was raised at the earliest opportunity. In considering the revival of a question of privilege in the new session, the chair is bound by the same criteria and has to take into account current circumstances. Quant au précédent évoqué,
in reviewing the precedents raised by the member, the character of the complaint in each case is important in determining if and to what extent it is relevant to the case at hand. For example, in his ruling of February 6, 2004, Speaker Milliken was considering the extent of privilege afforded to a member who called before the courts as a witness, more specifically, the immunity from testifying in court during a parliamentary session. The other case related to the evident gap in the law and the practices of the House relating to members found to be in contravention of the Canada Elections Act. Both cases had far-reaching implications that were not bound by the limits of the session. For this reason, the Speaker accepted that the House should have the opportunity to examine these questions and agreed to find, again, that they met the prima facie threshold. The circumstances involved in the issue before the House are now substantially different. Bill C-7 is no longer before the House, nor is the infraction of this premature disclosure.
requirements, the Chair has observed that the issue was not raised at the earliest opportunity. While we might understand why there would be reluctance to raise questions of privilege on the opening day or the new Parliament or session, notice should be submitted early. This seems particularly pertinent in the case that seeks to revive a question of privilege from a previous session. Given these circumstances, the Chair does not find that the matter should take precedence over all other business of the House. Grounds are not sufficiently compelling in this case. I therefore rule that the question of privilege has not been made out. Thank you. Merci. Orders of the day.
These people are crazy. This is going to be a disaster.